Hello, this is Victoria Williams from mymusictheory.com, and in this video I'm going to walk you through how to do the figured-based realisation question from the ABRSM Grade 6 Music Theory exam. So this is question 2 from the exam paper, and it's worth 15 points or 15% of the exam in total. The first thing we need to do when we're doing this question is to work out what key the music's in. So first of all we'll look at the key signature. And in this case, 4 flats represents the two key signatures of A flat major and F minor, but you need to know which one it is. So the quickest way to do this is to look at the last note, because the last note in the piece is always going to be part of a cadence, and a cadence can only ever end on chords 1 or 5. So this note has to be in those chords, one of those chords. So here we have the note F, and in the key of F minor, obviously that is the tonic note and it's part of the tonic chord. But in the key of A flat major, it doesn't feature in the tonic chord, which is A flat major, or in the dominant chord, which would be E flat major. So we know that the key of this piece is F minor. So I'm assuming you do know how the figures work. This video is more about how to put that knowledge into practice to do a good realisation. But I'll just give you a quick recap of how the figures work just in case. So, for example, when we have a blank space under a note, the F here has nothing underneath it, it actually means that you need a 5-3 or a root position chord. So a blank space is the same as a 5-3. The number 6 on its own refers to a 6-3 chord, which is the same as a first inversion chord, and a 6-4 is a second inversion chord. So 5-3 is a root position, 6-3 is the first inversion, and 6-4 is a second inversion. When you see an accidental on its own, for example this one here, an accidental on its own always refers to the third note above the bass. So in this case, because we've got a C in the bass and a natural symbol, the E above the C is going to need a natural accidental, so we need E naturals in that chord. If you see an accidental which is not on its own and it's next to a number, it refers to that number. So in this case, the 6th above the bass needs a natural, which is an E natural again, because a 6th above G is E. In the last chord here, we have another one on its own, and so that's going to affect the 3rd above the bass. So instead of having A flat, because of the key signature, this chord is going to need an A natural, so it's going to end on an F major chord instead of F minor. What I suggest you do next is actually write in the notes of each chord underneath the figured bass. This is going to help you see more quickly which notes you need to put into each chord, and also to see which notes you can choose from as you go along. So for example, the first chord is going to be an F minor chord in first inversion, so we'll write down the notes of the F minor chord. The next chord is a C major chord in second inversion, so we'll note down the notes of C major. And so on. I won't do each chord one by one in this video because it will take quite a lot of time, so I'll just put all the other chords in now. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is put in the complete soprano part, which is the melody of the piece. And we're going to do this rather than working chord by chord, because the soprano part needs to have a really good tuneful melody, which means we need to have the biggest selection of notes to choose from as we're putting in that part. The alto and the tenor parts tend to be quite static and use a lot of repeated notes, but the soprano part needs to sound good. And to achieve this, there are some principles that we should follow. So firstly, we want the soprano part to mostly move by step, which means by a scale step or a second. We can also move by a third, that would be okay, but we should really avoid bigger leaps of a 4th, a 5th, and definitely not a 6th or a 7th or an octave. We also want to make sure we avoid any augmented or diminished intervals, and the reason for this is that originally this kind of music was always sung, and it's quite difficult to get the pitch right when it's an augmented or a diminished interval, so the style of this kind of music generally will avoid augmented and diminished intervals. As we're putting in the soprano part, we also need to keep a close eye on consecutive fifths or consecutive octaves, also known as parallel fifths and octaves, and this happens when we have an interval, for example, of an octave between the two parts, which moves to a different interval of an octave. So, for example, C and a C moving to an F and an F, and that's not allowed. Another thing to watch out for is the leading note, and this is why we need to know what key we're in so that we know what the leading note is. So in this case we're in F minor, and the leading note is going to be E natural, and we want to avoid doubling the leading note, especially when the chords are moving from the dominant to the tonic. And finally, do remember that we need to be able to fit in an alto and a tenor part between the soprano and the bass part, so you do need to make sure you've left enough space. But also, don't go too high. I would avoid writing higher than A above the stave for the soprano part, and probably keep to G really to be on the safe side. So let's get started. So we're going to work on the soprano part by looking at the available notes and then working out which notes are okay because they don't break any rules, and then out of the notes that are left we need to look ahead to see what's going to happen in the next chord to work out which the best note is going to be. Okay, so let's get started. So for the first soprano note we can choose from F, A flat or C. Let's see which of these is going to work the best. So if we start on an F and we look at the next chord, where can we go in the next chord? We could move from an F to a C. Well, that's quite a big jump. It would be a fourth or a fifth, so it's not great. We can move from F to E. That's a step, so that's fine. And we could also move from F to G, which is a step in the opposite direction, so that's also fine. So starting on a note F is going to be all right. Starting on the A flat, we could potentially move from A flat to C, but that's a movement of a third, which is slightly bigger than the second that we could use from F. A flat to E isn't going to work because that's an augmented or a diminished interval, and A flat to G is also not going to work because that's what's happening here in the bass, and it would make consecutive octaves because it's copying the bass. So if we started on the A flat we could only move to C, and it's not as good as starting on an F because the leap is bigger. On to the next chord. So we've chosen the note F. If we move to C it's a big leap. If we move to E it's a step, and if we move to G it's a step. So let's discount the C because it's a leap. Between the E and the G, if we move to G we would be moving in contrary motion with the bass, which is always preferable. If we move to E, we would be moving downwards, which is the same as the direction of the bass, so that's called similar motion. Contrary motion is usually better, but it's not the only thing that you need to consider. Before we make a choice, we're going to look ahead. Again, it's always the best thing to do is to look at what's going to be available in the next chord. So if we went to a G, in the next chord we would only be able to move to F or A flat because C would be a big jump. But in fact we wouldn't be able to move to F because this is what happens in the bass, so that would be consecutive octaves. So we can't move from G to F, and we can't move from G to C. And G to A flat, although it's possible, it is getting very high on the stave. So I would discount all three of those, which means I would discount using the G in this chord here, and we're going to opt for the E. So I'll put in my E, and also don't forget that because of the natural in the C major chord, we do need to add an accidental to the E. On to the next chord. So we've chosen the E in this chord. Where can we go next? We can move by step to F. We can't move to A flat because E to A flat is augmented or diminished, but we could potentially move to C, which is a third. So if we move to an F, let's just see what could happen afterwards. We wouldn't really want to repeat another F, so we cross that one out. We wouldn't want the big leap to B flat, so we could potentially move from F to the D flat, and that would work okay. Let's check what happens moving to C. Let me just write this note in to explain something to you. So if we move to C here, we have created an interval of a fifth between the soprano and the bass parts. And what we have actually done here is created an exposed or hidden fifth. And this is something which happens when the soprano part moves by a leap, so this is a third in this case, here, and it moves in the same direction as the bass, so it's moving down and the bass is moving down. And the interval that it's moved into is a perfect interval, which is a fifth here. And if you have all of those three things combined, so that's moving into a perfect interval by the same direction, by a leap in the top part or in both parts, then it's not very good harmony. It's not a very good smooth movement, and it will sound a little bit jarring and harsh. So that's something we would want to avoid. So for that reason, I'm going to discount using the C, which means we only have one option, which is to use the F. So I'll pop the F in there. And let's take a look at the next chord. So we don't want to repeat, so we're not going to use F. We don't want to leap, so we're not going to use B flat, which means we're only left with a D flat option. In the next chord, what do we have? So D flat to F, sorry, isn't a problem. D flat to A flat is going to be a problem if we move downwards, because we'd be leaping into the perfect octave, and we wouldn't want to leap up because it's too high, so we will cross off A flat. And D flat and C is okay too. I think I would choose the C, although it's similar motion and we do tend to prefer contrary motion, and the reason here is that I've already used two Fs in the melody, so do keep an eye on how often you're using the same pitch, because if you use it all the time in every bar, it's going to sound very repetitive. Moving on to the next, we're going from C, we don't want to repeat. We can move to E natural, or we can move to G. G is going to be a problem. If I put in the G, you can see again we have a fifth here, and the soprano part is leaping, and it's in the same direction, going downwards, so that's another hidden fifth. So we will discount the G. I could leap up to G, but I think I'll go for the E. And just to remember that we need an E natural in this case. Next chord, we don't want to repeat. E and C I think are both going to work, but going up to the G is quite high, and it's also moving in similar motion with the bass by the same interval, so it's probably better to go for the C for a bit of a contrast. In the next chord, we'll cross out the C, we don't want to repeat. The F here, let me just give you an example here. So if I wrote this one, again this is going to be another hidden octave, because the soprano and the bass are both moving in the same direction and the soprano part is leaping. So we're not going to use the F. That leaves us only one option, which is A flat. But we have run into a problem. For the last few notes, the soprano part hasn't been moving by step, it's been moving by a third. And what you'll find is if you move by a leap of a third or more, then the notes kind of stack up together to make a chord. And you have to be really careful that that chord does exist and is one that is used in the key. So in this case here, we've actually written E, C, A flat, which stacks up to a chord of A flat augmented. A flat to C is a major third, C to E is a major third, and if you stack up two major thirds together, you end up with an augmented triad, and that's not going to sound nice, and that's something really I do want to avoid. So we need to backtrack a little bit and choose something else. So the other options that I had with F and C, and I think basically we can't use the F because of breaking the rule about the hidden octave, so we will have to just stick to C in this case and use a repeated note. Going into the next chord then, so I'm going from C. We can move by step to B flat or D flat, or by a leap to an F, so I'm going to avoid the leap. We really do need to start moving by step. C to B flat is going to be okay, this isn't a fifth or an octave, and C to D flat is also going to be okay. So I'm going to choose the D flat because it's moving in contrary motion with the bass, and don't forget we need a minim or a half note here. Into the next chord, I can't use B flat because that's what's happening in the bass, that would be consecutives. So I could use D flat, but again that's being repetitive. So let's go to F. In the last chord here we have a 6-4-5-3 progression, and these have to be treated very carefully. The note which you write as 6 has to move to 5 in the same part. So if I choose to write A flat in the soprano part, then in the next chord I need to write a G. So you have to use that voice leading in the 6-4-5-3 progression, and in a similar way the part that you choose for the 4 has to move to the 3 in the same part. So let me just clear that off and let's see which is the best note. So we've got F. Should we repeat? Probably not. We could go to A flat, but that would be very high on the stave, or leaping by a sixth, which leaves us with C. This is an octave, but it's not a hidden octave because the soprano part is moving downwards and the bass part is moving upwards. It's in contrary motion, so there's no problem there. The other movement in the 6-4-5-3 is a repeated note, so the C here has to move to a C in the next part. This allows us to use the 6 to the 5 and the 4 to the 3 in the two other parts. This isn't classed as a consecutive octave, by the way. C to C followed by another C to C is just a repeated octave. It's not a consecutive or a parallel. In the last chord, I can't finish on an F because that would be consecutives. We have an octave C, and then that would be an octave, although it's several octaves. It still would be classed as parallel or consecutive octaves, so finishing on an F isn't an option. Finishing on a C is going to be fairly boring, but it's possible as an ending. So the other alternative is to finish on A, which is A natural in this case, so I think I'll go for the A natural. Okay, the soprano part is done. I've just cleared off all the mess so we can see what we're doing a bit more clearly. So let's go back to the beginning, and we're going to put in the alto and the tenor parts, both of those parts together, to complete each chord now as we go along. So you need to remember the rules of doubling and also of omissions. So basically when you have a root position chord, you are best off doubling the root. When you have a first inversion chord, you can double the root or the third or the fifth, but usually it will be better to double the root, but there is some flexibility with the first inversion chords. With second inversion chords, you must double the bass note, and if you have any diminished chords, which you'll find would be in first inversion, you also need to double the bass note. When it comes to omissions, leaving the note out of a chord, there are also some rules you need to follow. So you should never omit the root. That's one of the most important notes in the chord. Also important is the third. So the only note which you could ever leave out would be the fifth. You also need to remember the rules of voice leading. So within one part, the note should move smoothly, you're going to use the repeated note if you can, and if you can't, then you should always move to the nearest allowed note. But you still need to watch out for consecutives, and you still need to watch out for doubled leading notes, and you still need to watch out for augmented and diminished intervals. And the last thing to keep an eye on is the spacing of your chord. So basically a chord will have this general pattern. It's going to look like this. So you would have a big gap between the bass and the tenor, and then a much smaller gap between the tenor and the alto, and the smallest gap between the alto and the soprano. Now it won't always be possible, probably, with every single chord to have it spaced in this way, but this is the ideal, and that's what you should be aiming for at all times. And do bear in mind that the interval between the soprano and the alto should never be more than an octave, and the same goes for the interval between the alto and the tenor, which should never be more than an octave. But don't try and aim for the octave, aim for the smaller possible interval that you can. Okay, so let's get started. The first chord is F minor. We have an F already and an A flat, so ideally we're going to want to include a C. And for doubling, because it's a first inversion chord, we can double any of the other notes. For spacing, we want to put the top parts close together, so the closest note to F in this chord is C, so I'll put that into the alto. And we then have a gap where we have a possible F and a possible middle C, so let me choose the F. This is doubling the root of the chord. And this also means that we have a nice big gap between the tenor and the bass parts. The next chord is C major, and because it's a 6/4 chord, we need to double the bass note, so we have to include another G, and we also need a root, so that's a C. So moving by the smallest possible amount would mean putting another C into the alto, which means that the G needs to go into the tenor part. So we need to put some ledger lines in, C, E, G. And there we go. Just keep an eye on consecutives. Look at where your octaves and your fifths are in your chords. So we have an octave between the F and the F here. So you need to check if that moves into another octave. It moves to a sixth. We also have a fifth between the tenor and the alto parts here, and that's moving to a fourth between the tenor and the alto parts here, so that's okay. Just one quick note here. So my notation is not very good here, partly due to the pen that I'm using on the computer, but my F here actually appears higher than the G here, which is very bad notation. So when you're using your pencil, make sure that you do place your notes correctly. The F should be lower on the stave than the G. That's very naughty of me. Okay, moving on to the next chord. So we're on F minor again. So we've got two Fs. We need to include a third, which is A flat, and then we have a choice for the other note, which could be another F or it could be a C. So for the A flat, if I go to the alto parts, I'm moving by a third, and if I go to the tenor parts, I'm moving by a second from G. So I'm going to go to the alto part, the tenor part, because this means I'm moving by a smaller distance. So I'm going to need 3 ledger lines and then an A flat here. And for the alto parts, I can use an F or a C. So I'm going to use an a C, and this fills in the gap actually, because this A flat here is the same as the A flat on that space there. As always, check for consecutives as you go along. So in this chord there's no fifths, but there is an octave between the tenor and bass, but this moves to a third, so we don't have a problem. Moving on to the next chord, it's root position with B flat in the bass, so it's going to be a B flat minor chord. We already have a D flat in the chord, so the note which is missing is F. It's not obligatory because it's the fifth, but it's probably good to use it because it's always nicer to have a complete chord when you can. And we could double the root for the other note in the chord. It is possible to double the D flat in a minor root position chord. It is okay, but usually it's not the best choice, and the reason is it usually has a knock-on effect of causing problems with consecutives as you go along. So between F and B flat, in the alto part we want a small interval, so we'll go for the B flat, so that's a stepwise movement. And for the tenor part we can use the F, which is on 2 ledger lines. Let's check for consecutives. The soprano and alto move from a fourth to a third. The soprano and the tenor move from that's A flat to F, so that's a sixth to F and D to another sixth, so that's okay. The soprano and the bass move from an octave to a third, so that's okay. The alto and the tenor move from a fifth to a fourth, so that's okay. The alto and the bass move from a fifth to an octave, so that's okay. And the bass moves from a third to a fifth. So you can see actually there are 6 pairs that you need to check. With each chord that you put in, check those 6 pairs. You'll get faster the more you do it, so although it might seem time consuming at the beginning, it's really worth it, because if you leave all your checking until the end and you find a problem somewhere near the beginning, then it's almost impossible to fix that problem easily without rewriting absolutely everything. Next chord is F minor. We have A flat and C, so we must have an F, and then we can probably double the F as well. Let's see how it goes. Okay, so if I put in an F in the alto part, it's going to leap. Let me just put in the tenor part first, because that's going to be more simple. That's a repeated F, so that's fine. What options do we have? So we can use an F, it'll be a leap. We can't use an A flat because the bass is moving from B flat to A flat. We could use a C and use a single note shared by the soprano and the alto parts. This is a possibility, and it's okay to do that, which is going into 3-part harmony, but it's only okay to do it probably once in the exam question. You're supposed to be writing in 4-part harmony, so it's kind of a way to fix a problem, but it's not something you can do all the way through. As always, the best thing to do is to look at what's going to happen next to figure out what the best solution would be. So if I go for the 3-part harmony solution here, in the next chord, which is C major, we'll have a C and an E, so I'll probably need another C and a G, most likely, perhaps 2 Cs. What can the alto part do? It could leap to a G, in which case we haven't really solved any problem because we still have a leap, or we could move, or in fact stay on a C and put a G into the tenor part, like so. And that does seem to work okay, but let's just have a look at the alternative. What would happen if we went with the F option here instead? So in the next chord we could move to a G here, and we could put, we could double the 5th in this chord, but I don't really like that. So we could go for a C, which means that the tenor part is now leaping by a 4th. So I think at this point, really, we're going to have a leap somewhere between the alto and the tenor part, so it's not something we can avoid altogether. And in fact, if I did put a G in the tenor part, it wouldn't be right, because that's what the alto part is doing, so it would be consecutives. I think both of the choices are 6 and 2 3s really, so I'll stick with what I've put in here. Okay, moving on to the next chord, which is C major. We could put in a G and a C. We can't put in another E natural, because E natural is the leading note and it shouldn't be doubled. So we can use the G again in the alto, and we can use the C again in the tenor, and that's perfect kind of static movement that we're looking for. We're now on to F minor, and we definitely need to include an A flat. which would be best off in the alto part, so it can move by step and a nice close interval between the soprano and the alto. And then the tenor part, again, can use a repeated note. We're now a B flat minor chord in first inversion, and we don't have a B flat yet, so that's a note which has to be in the chord. And the other one that's missing is F. B flat, let's try that in the C, in the alto. Again, that's keeping the upper parts close together. And if I use an F in the tenor part, I am going to leap. Let's see, for example, it would be the F here. But I think it's probably going to be the best option, because otherwise, if I do move downwards to the B flat, although it would work in this chord, it's putting a large gap between the tenor, let me just say, if I, for example, put this one, it would be a large gap between the alto and the tenor, which is going to be difficult because continuing onwards, we'd still have a very wide gap here between the parts. And so unless the tenor part leaps again, this wide gap is going to continue. So I think by moving to the F instead, we're keeping a nice closeness between the top three parts. The next chord is B flat minor again, and it's missing the D flat. I think maybe moving this into the tenor part and keeping a B flat in the alto part, keeping that part static, is okay. So the gap is getting bigger between these upper parts, but it's still acceptable. But I want to try and bring it closer together. We're now on to the 6/4 chord, which is part of the cadential 6/4. So we need the notes A flat, that's the sixth above the C, and we need F. So obviously we're going to move from B flat to A flat. That's the smallest movement that we can do. And that leaves us with an F to put into the tenor part. Okay. And the next chord, we have no option. The 6 has to move to 5. So the A flat has to move to G, which is the 5th above the bass in the next chord. And the same thing happens with the 4, which has to move to 3 with a natural, which is E natural. And finally, we have the F major chord at the end, so we can put in an F here and a C. Okay, I've been a little bit sloppy about checking for consecutives while I've been doing this, so let's just have a go back and see if there's anything there. So I got up to about here. We have a 5th. You know, to look for the 5ths first. So this 5th moves to a 6th, so that's okay. This 5th moves to a 3rd, so that's okay. There's no 5th in this chord. This 5th moves to a 3rd, so it's okay. There's no 5th in this chord because it's 6/4. The 5th here is between the the alto and the bass, and that moves to an octave. Okay, so I've looked for the 5ths. Let's have a go at the octaves. So we have an octave here. That's a repeated octave, so that's not a problem. In this part, the octave is between the soprano and the bass, so that's okay. In this chord, it moves here, so it's different parts again. And then it moves to these two. And then it moves, okay, we're not moving because it's 6/4 to 5/3, so that's just a repeated octave, and then the octave is here. So you can see that with each chord, the two notes which form an octave swap into different parts each time the pitches change, and that's what you're looking for. And there we have it.